So in this very short video, I'm going to be talking about how we actually manage the transformation process that the authors are talking about in this chapter. And I think one of the most important points to make is that in moving to becoming a sustainably managed organization, and keeping in mind, we're talking in this case about an existing organization that is going to undergo a change management process so that it can become a sustainably managed organization. What we're really talking about is developing a new identity, something that is ultimately clear not only to shareholders, if it's a publicly traded organization, but in fact to all stakeholders. And of course, as you well understand at this point in the semester, and I suspect even before we get started with this semester, we're not talking about creating a program, in quotation marks, a sustainability program. The implication when you have a program or a project or something like that is that it's short term. It's not going to be a long term thing. And of course, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about changing for the long run. So what's it going to take? Again, everything needs to be focused on changing the organization's identity. And Lawler and Worley have some pretty specific suggestions about what to tackle first and then what comes next and so on. And they argue that we should start with the work system, and then you can do the rest as a support to changing the work system. In other words, let's change how we do stuff first before we start talking about how do we reward people, before we start talking about what structure should we have, and so on. And another piece of interesting advice is they say move fast. Specifically, you don't want to lose momentum. And with this, I would wholeheartedly agree. If you slow down, if you fail to keep salient in people's minds, look, folks, this is what we're doing. We're changing who we are. We are becoming a sustainably managed organization. If you don't keep that momentum rolling, it's too easy for people to fall back into habits that you really don't want to encourage anymore. So this identity journey is really, as it says in your text, a transformation. It's not simply a transition. This is revolution. It's not evolution. There's a great theory that talks about change, that talks about punctuated equilibrium. And it says, organizations, individuals, etc., organisms, all open systems, they're going along. There are incremental changes. Okay, that's evolutionary change. And then there will be a sudden change. This is the punctuated part of the equilibrium. So equilibrium, punctuated. And so this is a major shift. And in fact, it's a major shift in identity. So we really want to keep this in mind. And, when you've questioned, geez, I'm not really sure how an organization is going to be able to pull off such a dramatic change. Well, it starts by, first of all, recognizing that what we're talking about is effecting a dramatic change, a transformation. And we are going all out, and we are going as fast as we can. So the sequence. Again, Lawler and Worley argue, let's start first by changing the way that work gets done. And then we'll backfill with support. So whether that's in terms of the performance management, again, is it in terms of the structure? Is it in terms of how we're doing our futuring? All of that's good, but we've got to start changing how we do the work. Because ultimately, what an organization really is it's a synergistic, so continuing to build and to build, the 2 + 2 = 5, that's synergy, right? The synergistic compilation of what every individual does. All of that adds up to what the organization is all about. So if we're going to effect a revolutionary change, the first thing we need to do is change what people do. Now, as you might imagine, this will be unsettling. And I think part of what we need to do is to tell people that we know it's going to be unsettling. Now, Lawler and Worley wouldn't necessarily argue that we should try to reassure people, and say, hey, don't worry, yeah, we know it's going to be unsettling, but at the end of it all, you'll still have a job. We know from our prior reading that sort of suggestion doesn't make sense. But to at least tell people, we know that this is going to be unsettling. We know that we're treading on what may have been hallowed ground in asking you to do things differently than you've done them in the past. But ultimately, we believe that this will add up for the organization to be, and for all of our stakeholders, to be a much more sustainably managed organization. So we lead with the work system. Get our house in order, okay? What we don't want to do is start telling people outside the organization, hey, we're going to be making all this change, because that, first of all, it sounds like, and it may very well be, greenwashing. Until we're sincerely changing the way we do things, we shouldn't be telling people outside the organization, oh yeah, now we're sustainably managed. We need to make sure that we actually are. So what Lawler and Worley suggest in order to get our internal house in order, they suggest the use of the decision accelerators, which again I think can be a great way to get all kinds of feedback, input, whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, when people participate in this kind of decision making, the odds increase rather substantially that they'll commit to whatever change is agreed upon, and ultimately they'll own that change. So this isn't just leadership from on high saying, you know, we just really need to be sustainably managed. Instead, it's they've all had a say in how we're moving forward. So the other piece, the other advantage, I should say, to using the decision accelerator approach is, on the one hand, it's giving us the content we need to move forward, but it's also engaging people in the process that we will want to use going forward for how we solicit input from lots of different stakeholders. Then we want to create a flexible and, very importantly, reinforcing system. So you've changed what people do. Now, what we absolutely need to make sure we do is reward people for the correct behaviors. Again, going back to basic reinforcement theory, people have a tendency to repeat those behaviors that are rewarded and to stop those behaviors that are not rewarded. And so if we are going to shift the way that people think, if we're shifting the organization's identity, necessarily we have to shift the reward system. Because see, the old reward system rewarded people for doing things the old way. And now we want them to do things differently. And that means we need to very creatively think about and implement a reward system that's really in line with those new behaviors that we want. And again, I would direct your attention to the article from CARE talking about, you know, you can't say you want one thing and then reward something else. In other words, you can't say out of one side of your mouth, teamwork is awesome, and that's what we'd like to see, and then reward people for their individual performance. Those two things don't go together. If you want teamwork, you have to reward team performance. And you shouldn't be surprised if you don't reward something that you say you want. You shouldn't be surprised when you don't get it, all right? Because human beings, again, are I wouldn't say we're simple. I wouldn't describe us as simplistic in terms of what motivates us, but we're not so complicated that some careful reflection can't reveal some important things about what motivates us. So again, we need to support those sustainable behaviors. We need to support the new work system. We need to make sure that we have a system in place that encourages and rewards change, innovation. You know, how do we make it possible for people to think innovatively, to do things in line with the triple bottom line? How do we make that possible? Next, we need to look at the structure. So again, what are we doing to maximize our surface area? What are we doing to keep ourselves as flat as possible, to make sure that people are relatively close to consumer or customer input? Consumer, if we're talking about external folks. Customer can mean internal. So anybody who receives what I do, that person is my customer, okay? So what are we doing to make sure that we're listening to all those people in that chain? Next, is the futuring process. So let me just take a step back. We start with the work system. Then we follow up with performance management. Then we take a look at the structure. Then we look at how are we doing futuring. And again, Lawler and Worley really argue strongly for the decision accelerator process. And I think anything that enables people to come together, that enables people to hear input from others, that enables people's input to be vetted, that makes clear the criteria for decision making, all of those processes, it doesn't matter what they're called. You can call it a decision accelerator. You could call it focus groups. You could call it task. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is what matters, not what the label is. Labels are interesting and they enable us to talk to people about things that we believe are the same thing, but beyond that, labeling doesn't serve a whole lot of purpose. Okay, so again, what really matters is we have a process that's inclusive, so we make sure that we're bringing in all of the necessary stakeholders, and transparent, so people know what information is being considered, how it's being considered, how it's going to be utilized, and so on. And ultimately, we want people to learn how to make good decisions, not only as individuals, but collectively. Okay, so this requires weighing multiple criteria, some of which may at least appear to conflict. It forces us to talk about priorities. It forces us to talk about sequencing. It forces us to talk about how we actually get work done. Okay, to accelerate the transformation, Lawler and Worley say this happens through learning. So they give a few very concrete examples. They say, first of all, we need to change our acceleration practices. We do this by engaging in 4 complementary, in other words, these things go together, practices. We need to help everybody in the organization share common understanding of what we mean by change. So there's a lot of conversation about what words are we using, how do we understand them within our organization, where are we headed. We need a dashboard for all of this to show people where we're at, how we're doing, what steps are left to take, and so on. This is related to the second piece, which is giving people an overall and systemic view of information. So as much as possible to help people understand just exactly how does our organization work, making as much information available as we possibly can, helping people to process that information. Again, there's nothing special about having reached a particular level in an organization that sort of automatically makes one a capable decision maker. It's not quite that simple, but a key is access to information and then an understanding of how to process that information. So we want to help people learn how to do that well. We also want to give people the opportunity to learn from experience. This will mean some success. It will mean some failure. Okay, so in the aftermath of either of those, how can we dissect the experience to really figure out, well, what were the positives, what were the not so positives, what might we do differently in the future, and so on. And then fourth, give local units as much as possible the opportunity to implement changes in ways that make sense to them. So this is, I think, excellent advice in that we want to decentralize at least as much as possible, acknowledging that there may well be distinctive differences at, let's say, in different sites, different locations that really require special handling. Okay, leadership behaviors that help to accelerate change. Consistently communicating a visioning message. Okay, let's keep everyone focused on transforming to becoming a sustainably managed organization. Devoting important and scarce resources to transformation tasks. So let's put our money where our mouths are. Third, helping people make sense of change. Connect the dots for people. Help them to relate what's happening to what's happened in the past and where we want to go in the future. And then finally, we must send the clearest possible signals in terms of here are the values, here are the behaviors that are going to be rewarded. Here's what you need to do in order to be successful in this newly transformed organization. Ultimately, this is a journey. It's not something that happens in a month. It takes time to transform an existing organization to one that's sustainably managed. Thanks.